Ploughing boldly on with this, the latest HITC Sevens series, taking a look at the greatest players of the Premier League era during the same year in which the Breakaway League turns 30 years old, this is the third video of the series. If you haven't already seen them, feel free to go back and watch my countdown of the 7 greatest goalkeepers and right-backs at some stage, but today is the turn of the centre-backs, and it's at this point that things start to get really difficult. I think if you were to compile a list of, say, the 7 greatest defenders of the Premier League era, maybe only one fullback would make the cut. So it would be fair to say that today's video provides us with our toughest competition yet. A reminder, therefore, that this series is interested in the greatest players in each position across the Premier League era, and not just who had the best peak. So, both quality and quantity of performances are required to make a 7 that is as tightly contested as this one. Jaap Stam, for example, you could well argue, is one of the 2 or 3 most accomplished centre-backs to have played in the Premier League. But he only spent 3 seasons in England, and only actually played 79 Premier League games, so that counts against him. Aaron Hughes, on the other hand, played more than 3 times as many Premier League games as someone like Ricardo Carvalho, but not at quite such a high level, meaning that he too doesn't feature. Hopefully you get the idea, so I will shut up and get started. Oh, but do stay tuned for the honourable mentions because, like I say, this was a very competitive 7 and I think they deserve some appreciation. Here is, in my view, and my view only, the 7 greatest centre-backs of the Premier League era. 7th, Virgil van Dijk. I gave you that little spiel about the quality and quantity of a player's performances in the Premier League in the introduction, and that is especially relevant when discussing Virgil van Dijk. The Liverpool man has only played 181 games in the Premier League, which is fewer than the likes of Michael Keane and Harry Maguire, and also happens to be the fewest of any inclusion in this 7. That is simultaneously a justification for why Van Dijk only comes in 7th, for the time being at least, whilst also speaking to how good he has been during those 181 games in order to make this 7 at all. Not only has Van Dijk only made 181 Premier League appearances, only 114 of those appearances have come at Liverpool, where he has competed at the top end of the division. Age 30, one suspects, and indeed one would hope, that Van Dijk still has plenty of football left in him, and I see no reason why he couldn't theoretically end up ranking as one of the, say, 3 greatest centre-backs of the Premier League era. Certainly, in his first 2.5 years at Liverpool, Van Dijk was as good as any centre-back that we have seen in the top flight of English football during my lifetime. A giant of a man who rarely needed to get out of second gear, Van Dijk has very few weaknesses when he is at the top of his game. Given how complete he is, physically, mentally, and technically, juxtaposed with his lack of game time compared to others in this 7, I think he had to feature, but I couldn't justify putting him any higher than 7th. 6th, Vincent Kompany. I suspect most people would agree that, at his best, Virgil van Dijk is a superior centre-back to Vincent Kompany, and I would agree. In fact, even Vincent Kompany would agree. In May 2020, Kompany stated that he thought Van Dijk was the greatest Premier League centre-back of all time. However, Kompany has played a lot more Premier League games than Van Dijk, 84 more games at this point to be specific, and he spent almost all of that time competing at the top end of the division. Kompany arrived at Manchester City in the summer of 2008 before Sheikh Mansour, but he would be one of the few to survive the overhaul that was carried out under the Citizens Emirati Royal over the next few years. Kompany joined Man City as a defensive or even central midfielder, but he soon transitioned to centre-back, becoming the club's talismanic and inspirational leader for the next decade. I don't think that there is a single attribute that Kompany would rank as being the best at in this 7, but he was just rock solid all round. Quick, strong, intelligent, dominant in the air, vocal and an excellent role model, Kompany rarely let Manchester City down when it mattered most, and even popped up at the other end of the pitch to score some crucial goals, most notably one against Manchester United and what was effectively a title-deciding wonder goal against Leicester City. Injuries prevented Kompany from completing a full season at the Etihad during the second half of his decade at the club. But even then, he still managed to make a telling contribution, often at key moments, so he takes 6th. 5th, Nemanja Vidic. Sir Alex Ferguson had a reputation for getting his transfer business done early during the summer window, and of typically overlooking the January window entirely when teams tended to be more desperate and fees were often inflated. He broke with that tradition in January 2006, and for very good reason, as Manchester United signed Nemanja Vidic and Patrice Evra just 5 days apart. Both would go on to become club legends, but it is Vidic who is the focus of this seven. Vidic was, in many respects, the perfect partner to Rio Ferdinand. Brought in from Spartak Moscow as a 24-year-old, across his first 5 full seasons in the Premier League, I would say Vidic was the outstanding centre-back in the Premier League. A throwback in many respects, Vidic was tough, brave, and very aggressive. Always first to the ball, invariably he would win it, and on the rare occasions in which he didn't, Ferdinand would be on hand to sweep up. Vidic was the first defender to be named as the Premier League Player of the Season, and he remains the only defender to have won that award twice. The only other 2-time winners are Thierry Henry and Cristiano Ronaldo in any position, which, isn't bad company for a no-nonsense Serbian centre-back to be in alongside. Vidic made the PFA Team of the Year 4 times, which is the joint second most appearances of any centre-back during the Premier League era, and in 2012, he was voted by the public into a 20th anniversary Premier League era best 11. Vidic's last few seasons at Old Trafford were disrupted by injuries, and he wasn't quite the physical force of his earlier years. But with 211 Premier League appearances under his belt, at least 150 of them of the very highest calibre, he takes 5th for me. 4th, Tony Adams. Purely defensively, in terms of the fundamentals of defensive positioning, organisation, man marking, aerial ability, blocking shots, and dispossessing opponents, I would say Tony Adams is the toughest centre-back to come up against, and therefore surely the greatest in that respect, that we have seen in the Premier League. For that reason, when I did my first draft for this 7, creating a 33-man shortlist before whittling them down to just 7, I penciled Tony Adams in at 2nd place. And that is where he would have remained had he spent, like every other player in this 7, his entire career playing during the Premier League era. Unfortunately, Tony Adams began his professional career in 1983, and he was soon to turn 26 at the time of the Premier League's breakaway from the First Division. He still went on to play 255 games in the newly formed league, keeping a remarkable 115 clean sheets during that time, as the key cog in an outstanding defensive unit at Arsenal. Adams became Arsenal's club captain in 1988 at the age of only 21, and he would captain them for the next 14 years. His 4 championships, 2 of which came during the Premier League era, give him the unique distinction of being the only player to captain a team to winning top-flight league titles in 3 different decades. Adams wasn't the quickest or most gifted of centre-backs, though he did become more confident on the ball under Arsene Wenger. But when it came to blocking shots, timing his tackles, and generally just keeping the ball out of his own net, arguably the Premier League has not seen anyone better. 3rd, Sol Campbell. Sol Campbell is among the finest centre-backs from the Premier League and indeed beyond during my lifetime, and I am always a little bit bemused when he isn't recognised as such. Alright, maybe I can understand why Spurs fans wouldn't want to recognise him as such, but no one else. The complete centre-back, Campbell was tough, intelligent, and a fantastic athlete. He broke through young at Tottenham, initially filling in at both right back and left back, but he soon settled at centre back, which was always his strongest position. The season in which Campbell made his debut was also the Premier League's debut campaign, and before long, he was one of the outstanding defenders in the division and a nailed-on starter for England. A 3-time PFA Team of the Year inclusion, Campbell was also the only player from a star-studded England team to make the team of the tournament at the 2002 World Cup. 4 years later, he became the first player ever to represent England at 6 consecutive international tournaments. Campbell made a grand total of 503 Premier League appearances, the 3rd most of any centre-back, just 5 games off top spot, and the 13th most of any player in any position, ahead of the likes of Wayne Rooney and Paul Scholes. Of course, Campbell very famously, or infamously, depending upon your club allegiances, ran down his contract at Tottenham before joining the club's North London rivals on a free transfer. The move earned Campbell the nickname Judas among Spurs fans, though it also saw him win 2 Premier League titles and 3 FA Cups. Whatever your views on him as a person though, Campbell was a sensational centre-half, and his spot in third was pretty ironclad based upon my criteria. Second, John Terry. If I were to hazard a guess, I think the common perception among most football fans in England is that John Terry is the greatest centre-back of the Premier League era. And I must admit, it is an opinion that I can completely understand. And indeed, it is one that I used to hold. With age, most centre-backs gain a greater understanding of the game and positional sense, which can compensate for the fact that their speed is starting to desert them. In the case of John Terry, however, he just seemed to have been born with first-class positional instincts and a remarkable defensive nous. Positionally, I think he is the best centre-back that we have seen in the Premier League, and that wasn't all that he had going for him. A fantastic leader and a talismanic captain at Chelsea, Terry was a commanding presence, incredibly brave and committed. Not a giant at 6'2" tall, Terry possessed a fantastic, determined leap, attacking the ball with real purpose, which made him a titan in both boxes and saw him score a career total of 74 goals. Deceptively quick, at least up until his early to mid-30s, Terry was typically partnered with a more technically gifted centre-back at both club and international level. But whilst he was not a bona fide ball-playing centre-back, his distribution was almost always safe and accurate, even if it wasn't as incisive or as adventurous as his comrade at centre-back. Terry played 492 games of Premier League football, all of them coming at Chelsea, and he won more Premier League titles as a club captain than any other player. A 4-time PFA Team of the Year inclusion and 5-time FIFA Pro World 11 inclusion, Terry was a formidable centre-back, and I think most people would agree that he would have to make a best 11 of the Premier League era, or at the very least, make the bench. First, Rio Ferdinand. As I said just a moment ago, I think if you polled followers of the Premier League on who is the greatest centre-back in the history of the division, most would go with John Terry. However, if you were to put that same question to players and managers, at least those who played and managed during Ferdinand's time in the Premier League, I suspect a majority would go with him. Ultimately, I think Ferdinand is the greatest Premier League and English defender of my lifetime, and I think he would come very close to making an all-time England 11. A born footballer who simply had it all, Ferdinand might have become a centre-forward or a number 10 were it not for his size and presence on a football pitch. Gifted and incredibly composed in possession of the ball, Ferdinand was unlike anything the English game produced in at least 30 years. I have a soft spot for ball-playing centre-halves, which always gave Ferdinand the edge in terms of this 7, but I do think that he just had that bit extra above every other defender that we have seen in the Premier League. Starting purely with the numbers, Ferdinand played 504 Premier League games, the second most of any centre-back in the history of the division, trailing Jamie Carragher by just 4 appearances. During that time, he broke the British record transfer fee twice before he had even turned 24, he made the PFA Team of the Year 6 times, which is a record among centre-backs, and puts him level in terms of inclusions in that side with Thierry Henry, and were it not for an 8-month ban that he received right at his peak, his position in top spot might be even more unassailable within this 7. My only regret when it comes to Rio Ferdinand, as I've mentioned previously on this channel, is that Glenn Hoddle didn't get longer to work with him at international level. Hoddle loved technically gifted footballers, and had ambitions of turning Ferdinand into a continental, almost Franz Beckenbauer-style sweeper, where I strongly suspect he would have flourished. In the end, he became a more traditional centre-back, just one that was very good on the ball, but in spite of the what-ifs, he still managed to become, to my mind, the greatest centre-back that we have seen in the Premier League. So that is it for my top 7, but I implored you to stay tuned for my most honourable of mentions, and thank you sincerely for doing so. Chelsea trio Marcel Desailly, Ricardo Carvalho, and Gary Cahill all came close to featuring, and Desailly and Carvalho in particular, had they spent just a bit longer in the Premier League, likely would have made the cut. Steve Bruce and Gary Pallister fall victim only to having played a lot of their football prior to the creation of the Premier League, though I still think Pallister can consider himself unfortunate to have missed out. Similarly, Paul McGrath was as good as anyone in this 7 at his best, but only managed 5 seasons in the Premier League, and probably played his very best football in the final years of the First Division. Jaap Stam's inclusion was explained in the introduction, and both Ruben Dias and Aymeric Laporte missed out for similar reasons. Elsewhere, the likes of Jamie Carragher, Sylvain Distin, Kolo Touré, Ledley King, Phil Jagielka, Jonathan Woodgate, William Gallas, Sami Hyypiä, Jan Vertonghen, Toby Alderweireld, Mark Wright, Colin Hendry and Gareth Southgate just go to emphasise the quality of centre-back that we have been fortunate enough to witness in English football over the past 3 decades. Woodgate and King, it must be said, without injuries, could have been as good as just about anyone, and would have made for some really interesting selection dilemmas for various England managers, in addition to me, with regards to this 7 of course. Sadly, Ledley King had a glass knee and Jonathan Woodgate was built out of honeycomb, but they still managed to make my shortlist, and for very good reason. Thank you all very much as ever for watching today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it and are enjoying this series. Hit the like button if that was the case, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you are subscribed to see future videos in this series and, future videos in general. You can also find me on social media, on Twitter or Instagram by the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.